Hi, this is Sana Hashmi. I'm a fellow at Taiwanese Shareshin Foundation. And this week I covered what is Chinese strategic community is saying about Prime Minister Narendra Modi's visit to China after 7 years, and mostly how they are reviewing the prospects of the India-China relationship after Modi and Xi Jinping meet. So, of course, after 7 years, Prime Minister Narendra Modi finally returned to India. His last visit was to Wuhan, China, for the informal summit. And now his visit to Tianjin for the Shanghai Cooperation Organization summit got a lot of attention. But the attention was just not limited to India, China, or the region, but globally it got a lot of attention. Why? Primarily because Prime Minister Modi's visit was monumental, and then, of course, the presence of the Russian president and the Chinese president, and then a number of other regional countries, including a number of Southeast Asian countries, participated in the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. But now, when we just talk about Prime Minister Modi's visit, what made it stand out? It was the timing. It came right after the US President Donald Trump's tariff war on India. And against that backdrop, Prime Minister Modi's meeting with President Xi carried both symbolism as well as strategy. So, some in China, and in fact globally, called it a diplomatic success, even a quiet rebuke to Trump. But in China, the broader reaction has been more that of being cautious. Yes, there is a welcoming response that this is happening, and then perhaps they're also seeing it through the lens of the US India rift. But the expectations from this visit, the expectations how the relationships would move forward, are absolutely measured. There are no over analyzed expectations. There's not a lot of optimism that this is going to transform the state of the relationships. Now, I mostly try to cover in this piece the Chinese strategic community perspective. So many of the Chinese scholars they use some striking imagery, and I'll give you some of the examples and that I've covered in my piece. Chin Kang Rong, who's a vice dean at the School of International Relations at Renmin University, he said that Trump humiliated India, and his humiliation of India had ironically opened the door for closer ties with Beijing. Then, on similar lines, Victor Kao, who is a rather hawkish commentator, especially on India, and he keeps coming on Indian news channels, who's also the vice president of a Beijing-based think tank called Center for China and Globalization. He even joked in an article that Trump had made meritorious contributions by driving India and China together. So, of course, there is a large chunk of the strategic community in China that is putting a lot of emphasis on the Trump factor in what they're calling bringing India closer to China. Now, there are other scholars who looked at the bigger picture. For example, Lin Minwang, who's a professor and vice dean at Fudan University's Institute of International Studies, he noted that Modi's in-person visit showed positive momentum in India-China relation. And I think coming from him, who has been very hawkish, very pessimistic about India-China relations, it shows that the strategic community is also now seeing India-China relation in a very, very new light. Not very optimistic, but at least moving away from this deterioration of relationship, or even paranoid tone, language, or derogatory content that we have seen on India for a very, very long time. Then another scholar, Chang Shuqian, who is associate researcher at the Institute of South Asian Studies, China Academy of Contemporary International Relations, that is a renowned think tank in Beijing, agreed, saying that Modi's presence at the summit sent a clear message, clear signal that New Delhi wants to ease tensions with China. And this is something that has been echoed by a number of scholars and commentators. For example, Cho Rong, who's an international affairs analyst, he also suggested that the visit could even help pave the way for improvement in India-China relations, but at a larger level for a China-Russia-India trilateral summit. So basically, the resumption of the RIC framework. But then, of course, these are some positive views. but still not everyone was entirely upbeat about the prospects of the relationship. For example, Wang Se, who is associate researcher at the China Academy of Contemporary International Relations, also said the trip served two purposes. One, it was an icebreaker, but it was also a compass for how the relationship are going to go. In other words, it got India and China talking again at the highest level leadership, but it hasn't really erased the mistrust that has been brewing specifically since the 2020 Galwan clashes. Now, and then there is the question of India's strategy. So, of course, this is all whatever I have covered till now. It's primarily about the India-China relationship, but how they are seeing India's policy is: are they seeing a shift in India's policy or a continuity? So, I read a number of articles who actually talked about what India's strategy has been and what it is going to be now. For example, an associate researcher at the Center for South Asian Studies at Fudan University, Xie Chao, argued that India is becoming more aware of a paradox that the more it confronts China, the more dependent it becomes on China, and mostly economically. And he pointed out four reasons for Modi's perceived recalibrated approach towards China and broader Indo-Pacific region. First, there are economic considerations. Second, India has been frustrated with the U.S. tariffs and the bullying of Trump. Then, third, Washington's tendency to bracket India with Pakistan. So, this entire hyphenation with Pakistan is something that India is not okay with, and this is something that is not going unnoticed within the Chinese strategic community. And fourth, doubts about American reliability as a dependable partner. So his warning is clear that if India sticks too closely to its traditional US centric policy, perceived US centric policy, it risks narrowing its option. But then coming to public opinion, it was really interesting to see how Weibo was discussing Prime Minister Modi's visit. There was a hashtag that was trending, which was that after rejecting Trump's four calls, Modi turns to China and Japan. Basically, that he is ignoring Trump, but he is reaching out to countries, regional countries such as China and Japan. So this hashtag actually drew over 20 million views. That's a huge, massive number for a hashtag on India, which was not the case before. That actually means that India is getting a lot more attention now. But some users actually mocked India's closeness to Washington, arguing that China and Japan were more practical partners for India's market needs. There was some criticism about India's external affairs minister as Shankar, as he was absent from the summit, and a lot of commentators and scholarly pieces pointed that Jaishankar is mainly pro-America and anti-China. So his approach is something that actually put India into this problematic situation. But of course, there was this upbeat within the public discourse, but then there was caution too. So, scholars highlighted and commentators noted that Modi stopped in Japan before arriving in Tianjin. So, according to many, that wasn't accidental and that wasn't just about convenience. In fact, many Chinese analysts see it as a balancing act and a continuity in strategic autonomy. And what they say is that India is working with the US on security and technology, leaning on Russia for energy. It is deepening supply chains with Japan and seeking trade with China. So it is actually moving in all directions, and it is the multi alignment is very much in place. Then another scholar, Yao Yuan Mei, who is director of South Asia Studies Center at East China Normal University, described Modi's visit as special, which marked a potential thaw in ties, but the extent of such warmth is limited. And her reason for this, for describing this as limited, was Prime Minister Modi's decision to visit Japan before China and to avoid Chinese military parade that is going to happen on September 3rd. And according to her, it underscored India's tacit understanding of Japan's sensitivity. So basically, what she meant that for India, Japan is important than China, and there are limits to what India and China could do together if India is still following its balancing act. So, this layered strategy means that Modi cannot afford dramatic gestures in India's relationship with China, and his approach has to stay pragmatic. Chan Cheng, who is a Beijing based analyst, he put it that Modi's global wish for Guru image is real. It has yielded benefits. But India's clashes with China and its alignment with the US, which is still very much there, would remain major obstacles in any prospect in India China relationship. So, what is the overall takeaway? In Chinese eyes, Modi's visit was a welcome thaw, is what it was a welcome development. But it is also a reminder that India's principle of multi alignment, strategic autonomy hasn't really changed. And for Beijing, that means that cooperation is possible, but limits remain. And if I may borrow the phrase often used in the Chinese commentary, I may not agree with the phrasing, but the dragon and the elephant may dance, but they're keeping a careful distance while trying to cooperate where they're able to. And I think this is going to define the trajectory of India China relations in times to come. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time.